Good afternoon, everyone. Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive is a European legislation that has captured the attention of many far beyond Europe. Robert was just mentioning to you about this United Nations Forum on Business and Human Rights, and quite a few of us were in Geneva last week, attended this forum. And this forum actually brought together more than 4,000 people. And throughout 3 days of this forum, CSDDD was high on the agenda. In many of the sessions and side events, CSDDD was intensely discussed. There were mixed reactions. Some were hailing it as a right step towards the right direction in contributing to the corporate accountability. The others were more critical, stating that it is failing to meet existing international standards, or it is imposing too high burden, too high obligations for companies to meet. Whatever your personal view about CSDDD is, it is clear that it is one of the milestones that is currently happening in EU, because it is the first time at an EU level we are seeing the introduction of a corporate human rights and environmental due diligence legislation across the EU, across whole sectors. So, as Pascal introduced, my name is Basak, and I am one of the members of the team that is responsible for transposing the directive. And I was asked today to recall some elements of the directive and also say a few things about the transposition process that is unfolding now in Luxembourg. But before doing that, I would like to take a step back and mention a few things about the directive in general. So first of all, it is very clear that this directive doesn't exist in vacuum. It's a part of an EU legislative framework on sustainability and responsible business conduct. As Minister Mark already mentioned, it actually is complementing other directives like the Corporate Sustainability Reporting Directive, Sustainable Finance Disclosure Regulation, European taxonomy, but also more sector-specific and product-specific regulations, like the batteries regulation, the deforestation, forced labor, the conflict minerals regulation. All of these are part of the same EU legislative framework. What I think I also would like to mention is that those EU developments themselves are a part of broader trend that we have been seeing since pretty much 2011 with the introduction of the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights. So UNGPs, as was mentioned, as you all know, are voluntary standards of business conduct, but over some years, soon after the adoption of the UNGPs, governments started to realize that voluntary mechanisms in and of themselves may not necessarily drive meaningful change in all circumstances. So we started to see that in many countries, in Europe, but elsewhere as well, governments start introducing legislation. So when you look closer to these legislations, you see that they are differing. Some of them are what we call reporting obligations, so they are based on transparency requirements, and others are really core due diligence obligations, so they are expecting companies to change their conduct, to change their behavior. And first of these was introduced in France in 2019, the Devoir de Vigilance law, as we all know, followed by Germany, Norway, and some other countries were also contemplating introducing similar laws in their countries. This sort of fragmented legal landscape led to the calls in the EU, to the Commission to come up with, as Minister Mark mentioned, more coherent and uniform standards that apply across the member states. And that is why in 2022, European Commission stepped up and introduced this due diligence directive that we are talking about today. So that is the first general remark, but I would like to take a step even further and mention that these standards, every single piece of these legislations that you see on the screen, are actually inspired by key international standards. And these are the 3 key international standards that are at the core of these legislations. So the United Nations Guiding Principles on Business and Human Rights, the OECD Guidelines for Responsible Business Conduct, and ILO MNE Declaration, ILO Tripartite Declaration for MNEs. I would like to maybe take 2 minutes to focus on one of these standards, which is the OECD guidelines for multinational enterprises. Because as Pascal mentioned, I'm also the secretary of the NCP here in Luxembourg, and it is my task to promote the OECD guidelines. But also this is a standard that is really quite meaningful as we are discussing the CSDDD. The OECD guidelines are the oldest standards, so they existed. They were adopted actually in 1976. But since then, they have been revised and updated several times, the last one being last year in June. And they include the UNGP's Business and Human Rights Framework, but they extend this to other areas of business ethics, like consumer protection, disclosure, environment. They have reference to climate change as well. What is interesting about the OECD guidelines is that currently there are 53 countries that have committed to implementing those guidelines. Luxembourg is clearly one of the founding ones, actually, but also the last one, Mauritius joined recently. So 53 countries have made a binding commitment to have national contact points, which are tasked with promoting those guidelines, and also they can receive complaints. Any interested party can submit a complaint alleging the breaches of the guidelines. The OECD guidelines contain these due diligence obligations that we are going to be discussing throughout this afternoon, and OECD has constantly been producing several guidances on how to conduct due diligence. And the reason why I'm saying is that because companies are clearly in need of guidance currently in light of this legislation, and the European Commission has promised that they will come up with guidances. But even while waiting the European Commission's guidances, I'd like to say that we have clear guidances from the OECD based on the CSDDD requirements. Another reason why I'm talking about the international standards is that they are actually the CSDDD, in fact, the directive that we are discussing today, is an attempt by the member states to translate these obligations, these voluntary standards, into legally binding obligations. So then what is the CSDDD? CSDDD is a European legislation imposing due diligence obligations, and we will see in a minute what these due diligence obligations entail, although Minister Mark already mentioned the steps in her introduction. So introducing due diligence obligations to large entities operating in the EU, so they can be domiciled in the EU or non-EU countries that are operating in the EU, to identify and address their adverse human rights and environmental impacts in their own operations, in their subsidiaries, but also in their business partners throughout their chains of activities. So this is the core due diligence obligation in the directive. The directive also has a climate change responsibility imposed on companies, although this is not part of the due diligence framework. So according to this, then, companies are expected to adopt and put into effect climate change mitigation plans. And those mitigation plans are supposed to be in line with the 1.5 objectives of the Paris Agreement, as well as the European Union's climate goals for 2050. So then we have the core human rights and environmental due diligence obligations and climate change obligations in the directive. Now, a few things, although as I said was mentioned, but still a few things about what due diligence entails. I will skip the parts that was already mentioned by the minister, but then due diligence consists of 6 steps, and those 6 steps are based on the international standards, and this is actually taken by the OECD guidance, and the directive pretty much tries to replicate these standards, although we see certain terms are changing or certain deviations. But the core 6 steps are based on the OECD guidelines. And the first step is the policy commitment. So the company has to have a policy commitment at a management level, making a commitment to implement due diligence. Ideally, these due diligence plans should be discussed with the employers or the employee representatives, should be renewed every 2 years, or if there is an exceptional circumstance, even sooner. But then, in the second step, it's the identification and assessment of the adverse impact. This is, again, very interesting. this is also where we can limit the obligations that we are imposing on companies. Instead of having to look the entire value chains or entire supply chains, companies are expected to do a risk assessment first. So look into the geographies, sectors, or business partners, and try to identify where the main risks are. So this may be immediately in their first year, but not necessarily. This may be also down in their supply chains. But companies are not necessarily expected to address all the impacts that they identify, but really focus on those that are significant. So they can prioritize the risks, and this framework therefore limits actually the company's obligations by making them focus on risks that are imminent. Once the risks are identified, companies are expected to address those risks. There is a relational framework that both the international standards and the directive introduces. This means that companies have different types of relationships to an adverse impact. Although the language differs between the directive and the international standards, the idea is the same, that company can cause itself the negative impact, they can contribute to the negative impact caused by others, or they can be directly linked to the impact through their business relationships. And depending on how they are linked to the adverse impact, their response would change. Sometimes they're expected to provide remedies, but if they are only linked to the impact, they are not necessarily expected to provide remedies, but they have to use their leverage to change the company behavior. And then another, I think, important aspect of the entire due diligence process is meaningful stakeholder consultations, but Carol will speak about this, I think, in detail, so I will skip that. And once the due diligence process is identified, they have to follow, of course, what they have done and publicly communicate about this. I'm not going into details, but of course the directive and the international standards really detail how these steps are to be taken. Very quickly then, what is the material scope of the directive? So the rights and obligations are listed in an annex to the directive, and they are based on international treaties and conventions on human rights and environment. And the personal scope of the directive is also to large companies. So directive allows for staggered applications, so it doesn't it can start with very large companies, and then eventually, when the directive is fully in scope, it will apply to companies with 1,000 employees and 450 million euro net worldwide turnover. This also applies to non-European companies as well. The Commission has calculated, and according to their numbers, it will probably apply around 5,500 European companies and 900 non-EU companies. And then also, if the companies are not meeting those thresholds, but if they are a part of a group of a company consolidated, they can also be part of the scope of the directive. Plus, there are some thresholds for franchising and licensing agreements. SMEs are not directly covered by the directive, so directive does not target the SMEs, but they will be inevitably impacted by those standards. Because the larger businesses will ask SMEs to implement certain provisions. But the directive has some safeguards to protect SMEs and to raise capacity, and even in offering financial assistance. In terms of the scope, Robert also mentioned the financial sector. So the financial sector has carved out in the sense that for downstream applications, they are excluded, but for upstream applications and for climate change obligations, they are included. So then, very quickly also, the directive foresees certain remedial mechanisms. For instance, every company has to establish a complaint procedure within the company or an operational level grievance mechanisms, and there are certain criteria how this should look like, but individuals or their representatives can go to the company and file claims. Similarly, there are several provisions concerning multi-stakeholder initiatives. And these can be used to raise awareness of the companies about due diligence, but also can be used as a common complaint procedure. the Commission said that they will be issuing guidances, fitness guidances, how this should look like. More importantly, I think the last two, the supervisory authorities and civil liability, these are really novel things that are introduced with this directive. The supervisory authority means that every member state is now expected to either establish or use existing authorities to dedicate tasks for the implementation of the directive. And these supervisory authorities have several tasks to implement the directive. Plus, the directive contains also civil liability mechanisms whereby the companies can be sued in the courts of the EU for infringements of certain due diligence obligations. What will happen now then? What's happening now? So the directive came into force in 5th of July this year. This gives 2 years for the transposition of the directive. And then there will be staggered application that I just mentioned earlier. Following that, in 2030, the Commission will review the directive. So there's a revision clause, and this revision is quite extensive. The Commission will look, for instance, whether it makes to include financial sector, downstream and upstream activities in the directive, or they will also look into these annexes, whether they are sufficient enough. They will look into the impact on SMEs. So there are several things that the Commission will review, and they will issue a report, and if necessary, a legislative proposal in 2030. But so we have now 2 years to transpose this directive, and it was brought to my attention that, okay, 2 years is a very long time. So what does this entail, this transposition process? In fact, and I was discussing this with some representatives of other member states, saying that, why are you panicking so much? You have entire 2 years. But of course, in Luxembourg, legislative process is much more elaborated than the other maybe member states, because we have several steps. So what is happening now, maybe I can briefly mention, so when we are talking about European legislation, there are different types of legislative acts, but the primary ones are regulations and directives. So regulations, and I'm speaking to the back of the audience, to the business school now that may not be familiar with the European legislative system. So regulations are those acts that have direct legal impact. So when there's a regulation that they become law in Luxembourg or other member states automatically. The member state doesn't have to do anything. As soon as they are published in the official journal, they become a law. But with the directives, it's a different process. The directive sets minimum standards and certain goals that member states have to achieve, and then gives a certain amount of time during which member states transposes those ambitions, those goals, into their national laws in order to comply with the directive. So now we have 2 years to transpose this directive into our domestic law. As the minister mentioned already, this transposition process is led by Ministry of the Economy, but we are supported by an interministerial working group that consists of Minister of Justice, Minister of Finance, Environment, Foreign Affairs, and Labor. We are meeting weekly, so every week we meet and we are going through the directive. We will be attending to transposition workshops that will be organized by the Commission. And as recently as Friday, we have also sent emails, some of you received those emails, to our stakeholders in order to conduct consultations with them. So I would like to invite all of you, if you have not received that email and if you're interested, to please reach out to us. The idea here is not to just have one meeting and call it off, but we will be welcoming your also written contributions or any contributions that you might have. And so the first set of meetings are proposed for the second half of December, so it's a pretty short deadline. But as I said, we are feeling quite a bit time pressure already, because the idea or the hope is that to have the preliminary draft law at the Conseil de Gouvernement by the summer of 2025. So we welcome any feedback you might have, and please do not reach out to hesitate to reach out. Thank you very much.